I am going to talk to you today about a part of maybe a longer term project. And my talk today is going to be called Cavendishian Hermaphrodites. And I thought I'd start with a note on a general project that I find myself within. It's not something that I like made up and like laid out, but something that I seem to be working on is to find trans figures at the origin, as it were, of materiality, the human psyche, the human body, etc., and not as a special case. I think it started when I reread Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, of all books, and I found an interesting passage there. And since then, it's been haunting me a little bit. And if you attended the Queer and the Classical conference last week, then you saw another part of that, so to speak, which I'm briefly going to recap in a minute. But I think one of the general ideas of that project is that like there are different versions of transness at the origin of things, and two of them are castration and surplus, so to speak. So like a lack and an addition, as it were. Last week during the Queer and the Classical conference, I tried to give a version of that in the metaphysical picture of Lucretius through atoms, voids, and spheres. I'm just going to briefly recap that because it's going to be important to what I'm going to say, what I have to say about Margaret Cavendish. So Lucretius, first century BC Roman philosopher, poet, as it were, who wrote De Rerum Natura, of the nature of things, or on the nature of things, an important testimony of Epicureanism and atomism. He constructs his worldview, as it were, around like these three elements, I would say: atoms, voids, and spheres. So the general idea is that like the world is made up of smallest parts, which we call atoms, which literally means that which cannot be divided, and they swirl around a giant void, so like something where there's nothing, as it were, but they don't fall in a straight line through the void, but they have like at a non-determinate place and a non-determinate time, they differ from the straight path. This is what like some people call the swerve. So like this like minimal push that they have by themselves, and that's like his general model, as it were. And I'm not going to say so much about it because I said a lot about it last week. I just wanted to like give you this general picture, because one of the things that I want to do today is to tell you, or like to investigate, a 17th century appropriation or like development or appropriation maybe of that picture in the work of philosopher Margaret Cavendish, of whom I will tell you some things later. But what's important for now is maybe to look at this particular transness that I try to like locate at the heart of Lucretius's, of the Lucretian philosophy, and that revolves around the so-called Galli and a certain error in transmission. So the Galli are, as it were, a group of priests that existed in ancient Rome, who were the priests of a mother goddess called the Magna Mater, the Big Mother. And part of their initiation to priesthood was self-castration. And there's a lot of discourse going on around whether they're non-binary or trans, or they were read as women, or like what kind of what kind of transness, et cetera, But like, for example, and for the moment, I want to like stipulate exactly this indeterminacy, or this relative indeterminacy, gender-wise, as a kind of transness. And something that Lucretius tries to do, as it were, in this passage where he introduces them, is to, or one could think, and for the moment, and for example, I will leave it at that. We can talk about it later if you want to. He tries to, or they seem to be denigrated, right? So the passage in book 2 reads, so the religious poets assign the magna mater, the big mother, the galley, because they would shew by this type that they who have done violence to the divinity of the mother and have proved ungrateful to their parents are to be deemed unworthy to bring a living offspring into the border of light. So the idea is that the galley, as it were, stand in as a remainder, or like a reminder, or like a threat to all those who like do not obey their parents, as it were, as a manifestation of those who cannot bring offspring in the world because they self-castrate. So that's the picture that we get of them. But one thing that's interesting is that the materiality of the Lucretian text on the nature of things itself seems to contradict this picture. So like, transness is a lac here, is the castration. So the transness is generated through a lac, through self-castration. But as I said, like, the materiality of the text seems to contradict this picture, because as we know, there are lots of like lacunae and like lacking parts and cuts in the text itself, in the oldest texts from the 9th century, for example, that are extant of the Lucretian text. And one of them, interestingly, is exactly at this point where the galli are being introduced. You can see it here marked through the dots. And the passage is basically the passage that I just read out to you. But what is interesting here is that like the incision, as it were, in the text happens exactly in the moment in which the magna mater, the big mother, would have to be described, right? So what is cut out is a description of the big mother, and then like the text immediately jumps to the description of the chariot of the magna mater. So in a way, you could say that like exactly at the moment of the description of the galli, because the galli are like the priests of the magna mater, there's a cut, a castration, a kind of castration in the text itself, which, however, has not prevented the text itself from producing lots of offspring, because, as you may or may not know, exactly this text on the nature of things was hugely important in the making of the European Renaissance and the early modern period. And I'll say a few things about that later. But what I just wanted to say is that like the text seems to like act out against itself. So on the face of it, the text seems to say, if they're like the crucial members are missing, then offspring cannot be produced. But in the material text of the Lucretian oeuvre, there's lots of stuff missing. One of them exactly here, where he's exactly saying that, but it doesn't prevent it from producing lots of offspring. Another interesting thing about like this Lucretian argument is that the arguments for atoms void and the swerve are actually all counterfactual. So when he argues for the existence of atoms, I'm not going to rehearse the argument because I want to like get to Cavendish, but when he argues for the existence of atoms, he's basically arguing that without smallest parts of which things could be composed, the variety of nature could not exist. And when he argues for the void, he says that if things were like densely ordered, if they were like packed together, then nothing could move. And when he argues for the swerve, then he says that if the atoms were to fly in straight lines through the void, then nothing would ever collide, as it were. At some point, like everything would just go in straight lines forever through the void, and nothing would happen. But we see that that's not true. So counterfactuality is an important systemic part of the Lucretian way of thinking. So it is exactly that which is lacking, that which doesn't exist, that like gives his systemic thinking its convincing push. It makes it convincing to contemplate that which is lacking. So you could say, in a way, that a certain kind of like castration is constitutive of the way in which Lucretius is thinking. All right. So that was my little recap of Lucretius, which is to say that that there is a kind of transness as a generalized material lack that occurs in the Lucretian text materially on the one hand, and in the Lucretian way of systematic thinking and argumentation. And now I want to move on to Cavendish, 17th century, and ask how this assemblage, if you will, transpires into the early modern European era. And I will try to demonstrate to you, although I'm not so sure if I'm convinced by that right now. Maybe I'll annotate this in the end. But my working hypothesis is that here transness is not articulated as a lack, as a kind of castration, but as a surplus, as a more than. And I will try to make that palpable and palatable to you. All right. So Margaret Cavendish might not be familiar to all of you, so I'm going to introduce her briefly. So Margaret Cavendish was born in 1623 in Essex, Colchester. She did not receive any formal education, but she did have access to scholarly libraries and was an avid reader. She started writing very early in her life, mostly poetry, and then later on turned to philosophy. One of her primary addressees and interlocutors was her middle brother John, and this brother John actually became a founding member of the Royal Society. And Margaret Cavendish is known as the first woman to be admitted into the Royal Society, actually, and have conversations with the experimental scientists there. She then joined the court of Queen Henrietta Maria and married William Cavendish, and followed him to exile until the restoration of the crown in 1660. And in exile, the two of them founded the Cavendish Circle, which was one of these circles of intellectual conversation that rich people at the time would have. And the Cavendish Circle is particularly interesting for maybe three reasons. One of them is that here Cavendish did actually have, or like was exposed to people like Descartes and Hobbes, although they didn't talk so much, because allegedly Margaret Cavendish was very shy. That's what the literature says. Yeah, that can probably be read and debated. The other thing is that the Cavendish Circle is also said to be one of the several major contributors to the spread of Epicureanism, so of atomism, in Europe at the time. So we have, as it were, like a pretty direct connection between Cavendish and Lucretius, because Lucretius' work on the nature of things was the principal source for Epicurean atomism still at the time, or one of them. In any case, the ancient one. All right. So that's Cavendish, and Cavendish accordingly starts, as it were, as a Lucretian atomist, and is influenced by Lucretian or like materialist thinking in the Cavendish circle. And here are, I'm going to briefly just show you two examples of this. This is from her first book, published in 1653. This is the first poem in this book of poems. It's called A World Made of Atoms. Small atoms of themselves a world may make, as being subtle and of every shape, and as they dance about, fit places find, such forms as best agree, make every kind. The second poem reads, no, this is not the second poem, but like maybe like a little bit further down, of vacuum, and though that vapor fills those places small, we cannot think but first were empty all, for were they all first full, they could not make room for succession, their places for to take. But as those atoms pass and repass through, yet still in empty places must they go. So this is one-on-one Lucretian reasoning and Epicurean atomism of the time, right? So you can see again, the world is made up of atoms, and there's a void, or like a vacuum, as they say, in between them. The reason why there's a vacuum is exactly the kind of counterfactual reasoning. If there wasn't a vacuum, nothing could move. Right, 1653. But by 1655, she already turns to Descartes. I'm not going to like give the full trajectory of Cavendishian development here, because there's another point that I want to make. Instead, I will quote, or like I will show you from the wonderful 1666 Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, which I recommend that you have a look at because it's a wonderful text. All right, and in the Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, she says there's no vacuum. Why? Interesting first question. Why does she think that there's no vacuum? Well, as I have marked out for you here, she essentially uses a Cartesian argument. She says there's no place to flee to, but body and place are all one thing. So the idea is that her idea is that like nature in itself is one big moving thing, and that there's nothing in between its individual parts. But she's also like citing here a quintessentially Cartesian argument, which Descartes makes prominently in his in the book, the name of which I now forget. And the argument was hugely important, and the argument is that there's no distinction between body and place and space. And this was an argument that directly opposed the Aristotelian teachings of the categories at the time, where place is one of the categories, is one of the quintessential ways in which reality exists. And the question, of course, is why should there not be a difference, a distinction between body and place? Well, Descartes says, look, whenever you move a body, then the place at which that body exists moves with it. But that doesn't mean that like the thing, or like the space or like the area where that body was before was now empty. Clearly there is something still there. So you can see me now, maybe through a camera, or maybe right, now you should be able to see me, and now you're not able to see me, but that doesn't mean that you don't see anything. You clearly see the walls of my kitchen, and here I am again. So Descartes interprets this as proof, so to speak. Wait, this is wrong. Descartes interprets this as proof, as it were, for the fact that there's no proper distinction between body and place, because the body takes its own place with it, and then some other place that is linked up with another body remains. All right, so this is the background for like this brief passage which Cavendish gives here, which we will encounter again, which is why I gave it some space. So what we can see here then in this like brief line is really Cavendish turning from Lucretian atomism to a Cartesian model of matter. All right. But she also then seems to think that there are no atoms. It's not just that she thinks that there's no vacuum. It's also that she thinks that there are no atoms. And here's a passage where she says as much, because she says there are infinite changes, compositions, and divisions in nature. Now, like if there are atoms, if they're like smallest parts or of nature, then division, of course, must stop exactly at the smallest part, at the atom. So whoever claims that there are infinite divisions cannot be an atomist. Now, the claim that there are infinite divisions in the early modern era is usually linked to a certain kind of rationalism, such as Descartes' rationalism, because you can easily rationally conceive, as they would say, that things are infinitely divisible, right? So you can divide my face in two, and then divide it again, and then divide it again, and divide it again and again, and like there's no limit to that in your rational conception. Now, because Descartes identifies, as it were, reality and rational conceivability, that must be true. This like infinite divisibility, but nevertheless, she still has a space for finitude, and you see that in the lower part of this quote. Things are called finite by reason they have limited and circumscribed figures, and this is a part that I will comment on later. But for now, we should just notice that, like, although there's infinite divisibility in nature, she still thinks that there are things that cannot be easily divided. But I'll leave that as a little riddle for now and return to it later. Okay. Here she says, when parts separate themselves from such parts, they join to other parts, and this is the cause there can be no vacuum nor single parts in nature. So another reason for her to think that there's no vacuum, which relates to the previous part, is that, like, if you imagine nature as one huge bulk of stuff, and something is separated from something else, it doesn't go nowhere. So in a way, she says there's just no space for a vacuum, because whenever one part comes off of my body, like if I lose my hair or something like that, it's not that they go into nothingness. It's like, like my hair falls down to the floor, and then it's on the floor, and it's part of like the dirt on the floor or something like that. But she says there's just no logical, as it were, there's no logical location for a vacuum. All right. So Cavendish turns away from Lucretius and towards Descartes, and opts for dense ordering of things and parts and infinite divisibility of matter. And the core part of this new materialism that she floats is the argument for self-moving matter. That's really her signature move. Background, again, a little bit of Descartes. To Descartes, all variety in matter, all the diversity of its form depends on motion. So to Descartes, every particular thing is made up of a particular pattern of motion of individual parts that can also happen individually, or like exist individually, but whenever they move together, they are part of the same thing. So my hands, for example, of course, can come off my body, but then we're not the same thing anymore. Then it's just like my hands and me separatedly. But like as long as we have like the same pattern of motion, when I leave the room, my hands leave the room, we're the same thing. Okay. He also says that like when the division into parts, like my hands and me, occurs simply in our thought, there's no resulting change in reality. So in order for like any variation in matter or diversity in its many forms to occur, we need motion. Motion, as it were, is divisibility in matter, like in reality. Okay, now the question is, how does division and motion, where does it come from? Where does it reside? Because extension itself, matter itself, is not, to him, is not determinate. It doesn't move itself, which is why he needs God. So famously, Descartes assumes that God is the primary cause of motion. So God is like the first mover who like set it all in motion, and like now the patterns of motion are individual things which determine the cup and the computer and the chairs you're sitting on, etc. But Cavendish famously disagrees with this and claims that motion is material. For figure, motion, and matter are about one thing, and that no particular motion is or can be lost in nature, nor created anew. All right. So here you see, as it were, as a very similar argument to the space is body argument that I have detailed earlier, right? So here the idea is that like there's no real difference between motion and matter in a way, because whenever you have matter, it's matter in motion, because we know that like all real things are just patterns of motion. And on the other hand, we know that whenever we have motion, it's motion of matter. It's not motion of something else. It's not motion of like immaterial stuff or like, I don't know, whatever else there might be. So whenever you have motion, it's motion of matter, and whenever you have matter, it's matter in motion, which is why she says there's no difference between the two. And if there is no difference between the two, then transmission of motion would have to be transmission of matter. Yet mostly in colliding objects, no matter is transferred. Thus, things must move themselves, because otherwise, if you throw a ball, your hand will shrink. But your hand doesn't shrink when you throw a ball. All right. So this is what she like. Here she like very, very smartly, intelligently reads Descartes against himself. So she takes this like non-distinction between body and place, twists it towards motion and matter, and says, well, there can be no external causation at all, because whenever you have any kind of external causation, you would need a transmission of matter. There's no transmission of matter. Okay, which is why the particular natures are nothing else but a change of corporeal figuration of motion, which makes this diversity of figure, and things essentially move themselves, right? So like that's her signature contribution to the history of philosophy, as it were, like one of her signature contributions, that the whole world is made up of self-moving parts, not of externally colliding parts. Okay, and this is the this is the quote again that I gave you earlier that I thought I would say more about. So things are called finite by reason they have limited and circumscribed figures. We can now understand to mean that they're separately self-moving patterns. All right. Here's an example. This is a thing. In this case, it's a circle, and it's moving in a certain direction. And there are like certain things within it. It's like made up of particles, but they all move with it in the same direction. She calls it homogeneous if the things are all the same kinds of things. In this case, it's a circle made up of other circles. She calls it heterogeneous if the thing is like made of like different kinds of things. In this case, the circle is made of like circles and squares. This thing, as it were, this self-moving pattern of circles that like move in a certain direction, that's a thing for her. Now, if we would cut it in half, then we wouldn't have a moving circle. We would just have half circles. So it would be a different thing, would be like a different nature, different form. All right. I'm getting a little bit of like Lucretian vibes from this. Maybe you can tell me later on if you're getting these vibes as well. We don't need this, I don't think. And this is where we should enter in her interesting theory of hermaphrodites. There are like curious passages where she says, for example, this: if art imitates nature in producing artificial figures, this is what I call hermaphroditical. Or she says, hermaphroditical, that is mixed figures. And then she says, nature is not a deity, but her parts are often irregular. In the context of the passage, that means hermaphroditical in a way. So the question, of course, is, what does she mean by hermaphroditical? Why is it hermaphroditical? Why is it not just mixed? What do we make of this? I'm going to give you like a little bit of of context here. So the major sources, there are two and a half major sources for like hermaphrodites in early modern Europe and Britain. In particular, the one is Plato, the second is Ovid, and the third one is the Queen. Plato, the Plato source obviously is Aristophanes' speech in the Symposion, where he's telling us of the original humans, which were two people combined, always like in a round shape, and there are those figures here in the original humans, which are allegedly androgynous. So that's one source that's being transferred into like the early modern period through Neoplatonism. Another one is the poem on Hermaphroditus by Ovid, where the story is that like the beautiful boy Hermaphrodite is preyed on, as it were, by a nymph, but resists her advances, and then she, in a sweet moment, she jumps at him, and the gods merge them, and he asks the gods to curse the waters that he's standing inside, to turn everybody into like a figure as he himself now is, which they grant. And that's a story that appears to like have experienced many rewritings in the Renaissance and early modern period. So that was like very, very much around, and a source of fascination and confusion, and right. So people would like translate it into different languages, rewrite it, extend it, put it on the stage, etc., etc. All right. And as Ruth Gilbert, in her wonderful book on early modern hermaphrodites, tells us, I mean, this is my formulation, but I would suggest to you that like hermaphrodites, like the figure of the hermaphrodite is actually a kind of like early modern queer, symbolically, physically, and in any way possible. So hermaphrodites in the early modern period do not necessarily only mean intersexed people. So it doesn't only mean people who are born with like allegedly unclear gender or like genitals or like gender markers. It can also mean feminine women or masculine men or gay people or lesbian people or people who like wear the clothes of the opposite, quote unquote, opposite sex. So it's a very indeterminate, very, very broad term, which is also why it is partially applied to the queen, who is a woman ruling over men, who allegedly has the stomach of a king. So there's like this fantasy in early modern Britain that like the queen might also be a kind of like unclear figure, kind of hermaphrodite. But the hermaphrodite also has an interesting, like in the early modern period, also has an interesting performative element, like a textual performative element. And that is that because the the notion of hermaphrodite indicates something about like gender and sexuality, it is said to incite desire and also anxiety about ambiguity. So like there's a performative quality of the term itself as it appears in the sources of the time, where people actually try to avoid the term or say, well, we shouldn't talk about it so openly because it's just going to make people crazy. It's going to like drive people mad, and that's going to be important in the continuation of my arguments. Okay, let's turn back to Cavendish and like talk about Cavendishian Hermaphrodites proper. Okay, so let's look at the passages again. It seems as though there was something about mixture going on here that was called hermaphroditical. And I want to briefly give you an example of like what that mixture might look like. Curiously, one of the major topics that she talks about in this context are scientific instruments. She says, for example, that if the picture of a beautiful young lady would be looked at through a microscope, then you wouldn't see a human face, but rather a monster. Wherefore, those that invented microscopes and such like dioptrical glasses at first did, in my opinion, the world more injury than benefit. So she seems to think that there's a weird problem here with scientific instruments, and the reason is that she thinks that the best optic is a perfect natural eye, and whatever other instrument you use in order to look at nature, it dilutes, so it obstructs or it distorts your vision actually. And the reason is that she thinks that like, so my eyes have their pattern of motion, and if I combine my eye with a microscope, then what I get is a mixture of the pattern of motion that is the microscope and the pattern of motion that is my eye. So if I then look with that at something like a young, beautiful lady or whatever else, what I'll get is actually not the pattern of motion of that thing that I'm looking at, which is the form or the essence of the truth of the thing, but instead I get a mixture of the patterns of motion of my eye, the microscope, and the thing that I'm looking at. Which is why she thinks that like the addition of an instrument, of a scientific instrument, to the project of inquiry is actually harmful, because it's adding more stuff into the mix rather than taking stuff out of the mix and giving us access to the true form of the thing, like its actual pattern of self-motion. All right. She also says that like the arts are not that are not profitable, but she says that like several arts are like several other creatures which have their particular natures, faculties, and properties beyond which they cannot go, and one creature is not able to comprehend or know all other creatures. know not any one single creature perfectly. So that's basically saying what I just said, right? Like just as a creature has a pattern of motion that like makes it, that like determines it, just like my little circle creature that I showed you earlier. So every scientific instrument has like a certain form or essence made up of a pattern of motion and adds to the mix of things that you perceive through them instead of like sharpening the vision. It's just distorting it in a different way. And curiously from this, it follows, as I will now try to convince you, that we are all hermaphrodites. Everything is actually a hermaphrodite. And in order to get there, we should ask ourselves, how irregular is irregularity actually, or like how artificial is artificiality actually? And there are two things to consider here. The one is something that I would call a Cavendishian swerve. So if you remember, like there's a Lucretian swerve that I tried to introduce to you earlier. And I think Cavendish has her own version of this. So we've seen earlier that Cavendish departs from the Lucretian picture regarding atoms and the void. There is, as it were, a remnant of the swerve, of the like self-directed this digression of things from their straight paths. And she articulates this here very cutely in the philosophical in the philosophical letters. She says, thoughts for the most part are made orderly, but yet they do not follow each other like geese. So they do not like just walk behind each other, because sometimes they do things in and of themselves, curiously. She makes a distinction in this passage between a vulgar way of like apprehending things and a philosophical and strict sense in which you can apprehend things. And she says that like irregularities actually only occur if you stick to the vulgar way of apprehending things. So if you stick to the regular sense, or like the common sense as a model, as it were. But if you speak strictly and philosophically, she says, and it's the yellow and the green part in the middle, irregular fancies and opinion are made by the rational matters of nature as well as those that are regular. So of course, every particular thing is made up of a pattern of motion, and whatever occurs in the world happens because of these patterns of motion. So never mind whether something happens that seems regular to you, or something happens that like seems totally absurd or irregular to you, it will always come back to these patterns of motion. So she says, in this philosophical and strict sense, where we abstract from our expectation, all irregular fancies and opinions and things that you might not expect are actually just necessary results of the patterns of things. Whereas if we're stuck to our expectation, as it were, then these things seem irregular. Right. So there's the vulgar way, the philosophical and strict way, and irregular fancies can be read in either way. Now, it should be noted that the relationship between the two, of course, is complicated, because Cavendish knows that she herself is one pattern of motion, and the way of her way of apprehending reality will be exactly that, her way of apprehending reality. So there's a little bit of a problem here with the philosophical and strict sense that she recognizes. Another thing that's interesting about this passage is that the argument for it is this: when I say that if all men's opinion and fancies were rational, there would not be such variety in nature as we perceive there is. So this kind of like, there would not be such variety kind of thing, you might again think gives off Lucretian vibes. I told you earlier that like Lucretius often actually argues through like counterfactuals like this, right? So he says like, if X was the case or wasn't the case, then there would be only one thing, or there would be no, like things could not procreate, or like things could not exist, or something like that. Seems to me that like this might have like a little bit of a Lucretian vibe as well. All right. So what we see is that art and nature are distinguished only in a vulgar sense. So like scientific instruments and like the mixed natures that they produce, and like the true natures, or like the self-moving patterns that things produce, are only distinguished in the vulgar sense. And consequentially, the denigration of hermaphrodites is merely akin to the vulgar and common sense, which nevertheless is a real element of nature, of course, because every particular thing has to conceive of the world to a certain respect through its own pattern of motion, but still it's only a certain pattern of motion. And in the philosophical and strict sense, everything should be exactly like this. They should all be mixed natures. So everything should be a hermaphrodite in this way. There's a second reason why Cavendishian hermaphrodites apply everywhere in nature, and it's what I call Cavendishian permeation. Here's another passage. Neither is any perception made by exterior objects, but by interior corporeal figurative motions, for the object does not print or act any way upon the eye, but it is the sensitive motions in the eye which pattern out the figure of the object. The object does not print or act any way upon the eye, but it is the sensitive motions in the eye which pattern out the figure of the object. So as you remember, to Cavendish, there's no external causation. So everything moves and forms itself by way of self-motion. So if you perceive me speaking, or if you see this slide, then according to Cavendish's model, what your eye does is it mirrors the motion of the slide in itself. So like and that's what she calls patterning. So if you have two different things and they move in different ways, that's what makes them different things. Then inside the things, there's a mirroring of the motion of the other thing that has you perceive that other thing. So the thing is not, here the things A and B are not A and B anymore, but they become A prime and B prime. So they become a little bit like the other thing. And that's what I call permeation. They permeate with each other. It's like in a love relationship when you start picking up on like habits of your partner, or like you have like you like develop the same kind of humor or the same kind of tics or something like that. That's what I call permeation. And I think to Cavendish, this is actually how the world works, right? Like things mirror each other in their own self-motion, and thus they become a little bit like the others. So when confronted with one another, things change themselves. That's what I call permeation. But that also means that no thing is just its own pattern of motion. All things are mutually constitutive, constantly permeating with one another. And that means everything is essentially hermaphroditical. Everything is essentially mixed in this way in which things perceive each other and become each other. Because remember, to Cavendish, there's no real distinction at least, between motion and matter. So what happens here is an actual change in matter. It's not a thing that like keeps the same construction of matter that's now moving differently. There's no real distinction between motion and matter. Instead, the thing itself becomes different because its pattern of motion becomes different. All right, everything is essentially hermaphroditical. We are all hermaphrodites. It's a truly, and now remember that like in the early modern period, the hermaphrodite will be read not necessarily as like as an intersex or a trans or a gay or a lesbian character, but like all of these, And of course, it also stands out as a term, right? Like this is signaling something. And this is what I'm going to focus on in a bit, and then I'll be finished. I think I have like 5 more minutes, maybe. Is that all right? I interpret this to mean yes. All right. So in fact, being a hermaphrodite means being affected by other things to Cavendish, and that means being a hermaphrodite means being animate, being alive. Now, one question is, why does she use the term hermaphrodite for that? Or what is that doing? And for this, we should remember that she's also a poet. So she starts her career as a poet. She keeps writing poetry. And this book that I made, that I pulled most of these quotes from, Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, is actually published as bound together with her own science fiction novel, which is said to be the first science fiction novel of the European modern era. So she's a poet. She knows how to use language and how to use the performativity of language. And I want to make 2 suggestions here. What the hermaphrodite here does. One thing is that, as I said earlier, the word hermaphrodite in this area, in the early modern era, does have an inciting quality, right? So like it signals desire and sexuality in a way. So by using the term hermaphrodite, Cavendish is, as it were, charging her text with like desire and like sexual energy in a way. And now if you think that she takes her theory seriously, and I would guess that she does because she publishes a lot about it and she's taking some hits for it, then we would think that she probably wants the text to change the pattern of movement of the reader as the reader is encountering her text by spurring, as it were, the desire of the reader in relation to her own text. So she's increasing the libidinal energy that's circulating between the text and the reader by way of like using this term in its performativity. And to my mind, that makes it a quintessentially queer text in its textual strategy. Right. That's my suggestion. What's happening here with the implied reader and the hermaphrodite. Another thing that she might be doing here with the hermaphrodite is you might think that Cavendish herself is acting against an allegation that she might encounter, namely of being a hermaphrodite herself. So as you may or may not remember, I said earlier that hermaphrodite is not restricted to corporeal matters, but can also mean symbolical deviation from given gender roles. So masculine men and masculine women and feminine men can be hermaphrodites in a way. And her contemporary Bain, who's a famous poet of the early modern British era, was publicly called a hermaphrodite, with the reason that she was engaging in poetry, which is a male craft, as a woman. So you might think that like by universalizing the hermaphrodite in this way, Cavendish is also implicitly, she doesn't say that as far as I know explicitly, but she's also, as it were, normalizing her own craft as a philosopher, which is probably at the time like an even more masculine endeavor than poetry, but also as a poet. And there are, of course, like many passages where she addresses this issue, but she always addresses this issue, as far as I know, with an eye to the benevolence of her readers. what I'm trying to say here is that like on a deeper level of her theory, she inscribes her own position, her own social position, as a sort of gender deviant being, as a female philosopher in the early modern era, into her own theory. So if you properly understand her theory, you will see that it's actually not her being the weirdo, is that we're all being hermaphrodites. And that's just what it means to be alive. And that's just what it means to be a material being. So I would think in this, or I would suggest that in this way, she has skin in the game in like turning, in like using this phrase and connecting her own social position to the systematic, or like to one systematic core of her own theory. All right, in conclusion, I just want to float this maybe to be discussed or not discussed. I think this, in a way, makes Cavendish the mother of feminist new materialisms in all the ways in which you can read this, this phrase. And that's the end. Thank you so much.